Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Back in Spain, Phillip raged. This devilish pirate, this dragon, had burned his cities, insulted him personally, and stolen his gold. In the Low Countries, this heretic Queen Elizabeth had installed her former lover, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, as the de facto king. Had his assassination of William of Orange been completely for naught? In France, Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, seemed ready to take the French throne. And on the British Isles, that heretic Queen Elizabeth executed his strongest Catholic ally there. She beheaded Mary, Queen of Scots. Everything appeared to be slipping away from Philip. So he called once again for his military leaders, and he ordered plans for invasion to be sped up. The Pope, intending to help, published a papal bull condemning Elizabeth once again. This bull ordered all church proceeds taken in Spain and Portugal to go directly into the coffers of Philip, and presented a lineage from Edward III, the King of England, which named Philip the rightful Catholic ruler of the English and the English throne. In preparation to help Philip take that throne, the Lords Parma and Santa Cruz gathered ships into one of the largest gatherings ever seen. Unfortunately, when they returned to England, the news that Francis Drake and the other captains brought back was not good, especially for the families of all of those lost on the voyage. The sailors had lost at least 40% of their number due to that horrible sickness that tore through them. It was a failure in other ways as well, a financial failure especially. The Crown had to come in and cover the shortfall to pay the soldiers and sailors their full wage because they had not made enough money on that voyage. Despite this ill news, though, the Queen was not entirely displeased. Her ships were still in good repair, none of them had been lost, and back home to guard the English shores, which is exactly where Elizabeth wanted them. And they had freed those English vessels and their crews and dealt that severe blow to King Philip. That blow was really taking its toll on Philip, who lay in bed, tormented both by the physical ailment, he had gout, but also by the psychological stress of what he saw as losing a war and perhaps losing the favor of his God. For a time, Drake was sent to Holland to give aid to the Dutch there, but quickly he was recalled. His plans to once again sail west and raid the Indies had to be put on hold. That amassing of ships, well, that was the worst-kept secret in all of Europe. Everybody knew that they were gathering a massive armada for the invasion of England. Once again, Elizabeth turned to Drake. The Navy, the English Navy, was busy building as many ships as possible. They were amassing cannon and crews, while the Winters and the Hawkins family constantly patrolled the English Channel. And Elizabeth turned to Drake and told him to gather his fleet. Once again, Drake was going to command from the ship the Elizabeth Bonaventure. The Crown also granted the fleet the ships the Golden Lion, the Rainbow, and the Dreadnought. They had a full complement of soldiers and cannon on board. This new fleet was supplemented by Drake and some of the other West Country investors. They had ships like the Drake, the Thomas, the White Lion, the Hawkins, the Elizabeth, the Edward Bonaventure, and the Minion, along with a host of smaller yet still armed vessels and pinnaces. Back in Plymouth, Drake had some trouble finding enough men to crew these ships, though. At the last minute, hundreds of the men who had agreed to go on board deserted, wary of Drake's dangerous ventures and the shadow cast by his last outing. Sailors can be a superstitious lot, and so many had died on Drake's last voyage that this one was avoided by a lot of men. This angered Drake, and he sent a missive to the Crown asking that any of the men who had deserted this voyage be arrested. The Queen declined to send her sheriffs to arrest them, but she did send soldiers to fill the crews, and on April 2nd, 1587, the fleet departed. It appears that the Privy Council sent some last-minute orders to Francis Drake. Quote, "You shall forbear to enter forcibly into any of the said king's ports or havens, or to offer violence to any of his towns or shipping within harboring, or do any act of hostility upon the land." End quote. However, this command, for some reason, never seemed to reach Sir Francis Drake. On April 19th, near midday, the fleet anchored just off the Spanish coast. They waited near the port at Cadiz, which was a busy and well-defended harbor that was connected by river directly to the city of Seville. Drake called his captains in for conference. All along the Spanish and Portuguese coast, the Armada was gathering, but especially here. As yet, the ships from the farthest reaches of Spain's empire had not reached them, and all of the ships in port still lay at anchor. Nearly all of these ships were unmanned, and only a few merchant vessels were actually under sail, bringing necessary goods from ship to ship in the harbor to prepare for the invasion. Drake, against the wishes of many of the captains, ordered an immediate attack. At about 5 o'clock that evening, the English sailed toward the harbor. At first, the Spanish there assumed that it was the returning fleet of a friendly Spanish captain, and they sent a delegation to greet him. Drake, though, quickly dispatched them of this notion. He opened fire on the vessels. A couple of them were sunk, and the rest of them retreated to defend the harbor. Now, the Spanish galleys' guns, these smaller vessels, were no match for these English galleons, who fired well out of the Spanish range. The English sunk those 2 manned vessels, and still not properly actually in the harbor there, well, they took a 1,000-ton merchantman and then a 700-ton Biscayan galleon. They took 5 smaller merchant vessels, and then they took a galleon owned by Santa Cruz, the Spanish Admiral himself. When these 8 ships had been fully ransacked and robbed of all of the valuables on board, including the victuals and wine, they were set ablaze and cut adrift. Throughout the night, then, the fort and the towers fired at Drake's fleet, and whatever ships could be manned set their guns to fire against the English. However, it was really a poorly organized and ineffectual defense. The Duke, a man named Medina Sidonia, led reinforcements into the town. He had a contingent of both foot soldiers and cavalry, but they were unable to stop Drake from entering the harbor. All they could do was stop Francis Drake from entering the town, landing his men ashore, and taking the town there. At dawn, the fleet sailed into the harbor at Cadiz. They took every ship that laid at anchor and all of the crews that were too slow or too foolish to escape, and then lashed all of those ships together, which made it easy for them to take all of the riches they found on board. But more importantly, to this mission at least, they took all of that which is required to outfit a navy. They took rope and tackle and tar and lumber and sail and any navigational instruments they might find. They did this so they could cripple the Armada before it even got started, and they could use all of these goods to bolster the English navy. It was really a well-thought-out plan. Now, Drake did falter in one of his orders, though. The Queen had told him specifically that he was to burn any ship that he found in the harbor at Cadiz. And though Drake had all of these ships slashed together with plenty of tar and certainly plenty of fire, he failed to do so. Why? He exchanged the prisoners he had taken for gold, and the Duke of Medina Sidonia himself gifted Drake with a cask of wine and a basket of sweetmeats, and Drake left the harbor in a rush. Why? He left over 60 vessels in the harbor unharmed, if a bit lighter, in defiance of his direct royal orders. Why? Well, one possible answer is that Drake had taken some of those Spanish prisoners and had them questioned. One of these prisoners may have given up some sensitive information, perhaps even more valuable to Drake than burning the ships. It appears that he had learned that Spain's second most accomplished admiral, a man named Juan Martinez de Recalde, sailed with a squadron that was half the size of Drake's and was, at this very moment, anchored off Cape St. Vincent. It's also possible that this smaller fleet was accompanying the Spanish treasure flota, which was Drake's greatest lust in life. En route to get to the Cape, Drake encountered a fleet of tiny merchant vessels, really little more than fishermen's boats, and found on board what would actually wind up becoming perhaps the most valuable cargo that he would take this entire voyage. He found bound together bundles of barrel staves bound for Cadiz. I understand that this might not sound like much, but you have to understand that life on board a ship required many, many barrels filled with water. If you didn't have these iron barrel staves to hold the barrels together, you couldn't have water or wine, and your ships would be unable to sail, and they took time and money to produce, so perhaps the greatest delay that Drake effected this entire voyage was stealing these barrel staves. Still, though, barrel staves, while they were important, weren't exactly a rich prize. Drake needed a real haul, both to repay his investors and to line his own pockets, so he chased after Recalde, who had sailed away from the Cape. He was headed towards Lisbon, but Drake believed he could catch him. Unfortunately, the winds weren't in his favor, and Recalde managed to beat him there. Lisbon was far too well defended a port for the English to take, so Drake turned his attentions elsewhere. He took what was called the Sagres Castle, which had once, strangely enough, been the home of Prince Henry the Navigator. This was a symbolic victory, but not a rich one. Still, one monk did record, quote, "They committed their usual feasts and drunkenness, their diabolical rampages and obscenities. They stole everything they found and then set the place on fire, having first committed 1,000 excesses and diabolical desecrations of the images of the saints like wicked heretics." End quote. Then, on June 1st, Sir Francis Drake's fortune changed once again for the better. He learned of a ship called the San Felipe, owned by Phillip himself and carrying all of the goods from the Orient directly into Drake's clutches. It's said that the San Felipe was taken without a single shot being fired because her holds and her gun ports were too crammed with goods to fire any guns in her defense. On board, Drake found gold, he found silver, he found precious gems, ivory, silk, rich dyes, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, all in all worth $32 million in modern money. With this haul, Drake was finally able to sail for home. It was around this time that Francis Drake enlisted perhaps one or maybe two men to write all of his letters and document all of his deeds. You see, Francis Drake needed better representation to both the Queen and the English people, and the results turn out to be ludicrous. You see, Drake was uneducated, he was poorly read, and he had really abysmal penmanship, and suddenly his correspondences were beautifully composed with allegory and reference to God, the Bible, and history. For example, he is reported to have said at Cadiz, when the wind turned to his favor, "The wind commands me away." Yeah, no, he didn't say that. Francis Drake was a sailor and a pirate, and he knew ships and violence, not poetry. Similarly, at this raid on Cadiz, he is reported to have claimed that he, quote, "singed the King of Spain's beard," end quote, which was not true. That was actually said by the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire in reference to his own beard rather than King Philip's. Now, this new eloquent correspondence may have actually helped Francis Drake, though, when he returned to London. He found himself out of favor with the Queen, at least in official record, and defending some of his decisions during the raid on Cadiz. However, Drake showered Elizabeth with gifts, and he still had her ear. He may have failed to burn all of the vessels that he had been ordered to, but he had really delayed the invasion, and that was Elizabeth's need. He also brought news of Philip's true plans. He wrote to Lord Walsingham, quote, "I assure your honor, the like preparation was never heard of nor known. As the King of Spain hath and daily maketh to invade England, all possible preparations for defense are very expedient to be made. I dare not almost write into your honor of the great forces we hear the King of Spain hath in the straits. Prepare in England strongly, and most by sea. Stop him now, and stop him ever. Look well to the coast of Sussex." End quote. Drake begged again and again to be allowed another voyage, this time in force to go to Lisbon, where he could destroy the Armada before it even began sailing. The Crown, however, decided not to grant it. Finances in England were once again tight, and Elizabeth hesitated to back any venture that would take English vessels away from English shores. Philip, too, though, had suffered setbacks. In addition to the raid on Cadiz, he had been forced to call off the treasure fleets for the year, fearing that they would be taken by English pirates. They stayed in port in the Americas. And then his plans were dealt a truly terrible blow. His close friend, the Admiral Santa Cruz, died. Philip was forced to name the Duke Medina Sidonia, that man who was a hero of the raid on Cadiz, who had gifted Francis Drake wine and sweetmeats. He was forced to name him Admiral of the Spanish Armada. Medina Sidonia was a morose man, especially about the state of the Spanish Navy. He surveyed the fleet, and he found it lacking. They didn't have enough guns. They didn't have enough soldiers that were trained well, and the ships themselves were even sometimes in poor condition. He was forced to smuggle in at least 100 cast-iron English cannon, something that the Spanish thought were so low quality they weren't even worth using, but he needed the guns, but still they weren't enough. The Spanish had little powder, they had less shot, and they had only a very few properly trained gunners. Only 6 vessels in the Spanish fleet carried more than 40 guns, while every English vessel carried more than 250. However, Philip refused to hear of these complaints. He believed that God was on his side. The Pope himself granted special indulgences for every Spaniard on the voyage, and when confronted with the possibility of bad weather, Philip said, quote, "Since it is all for his cause, God will grant us fair weather," end quote. As he lay in his sickbed and his admiral continued to bring complaints to him, his very last command to Medina Sidonia was, quote, "Sail, sail," end quote. The Spanish plan was simple. The Armada would sail into the Channel. They would break the English naval defense there, and they would hold a landing site. Then, somewhere between 30 and 60,000 soldiers, under the command of the Duke of Parma, would sail from the Netherlands to England. They would sail upriver and take London in what they believed would be no more than 2 or 3 days. The sailors, though, in the Spanish fleet, well, they knew better. As the Spanish Armada was preparing to sail, one sailor wrote, quote, "Things hang in the balance. Please God, let the events be for his cause, and may he assist us, as is so necessary," end quote. Another sailor, when he was speaking to a papal official, a papal nuncio, said to him, quote, "The English, who have faster and handier ships than ours, and many more long-range guns, and who know their advantage just as well as we do, will never close with us at all, but stand aloof and knock us to pieces with their culverins, without our being able to do them any serious hurt." When the nuncio asked him what the Spanish needed to win, the officer answered, "A miracle," end quote. The English weren't entirely aware of the Spanish shortcomings, though. They thought that the fleet was a lot better defended than it really was. I think that Winston Churchill gives a good description of the English attitude. He said, quote, "The chances were heavily weighted in favor of Spain. From the mines of Mexico and Peru there came a stream of silver and gold which so fortified the martial power of the Spanish Empire that King Philip could equip his forces beyond all known scales. The position was well understood in the ruling circles in England. So long as Spain controlled the wealth of the New World, she could launch and equip a multitude of armadas," end quote. On the English side, the Queen's plan was to separate her navy, to guard the western end of the Channel from Spain and to guard the eastern end from the Netherlands. However, she acquiesced to her advisors. The Lord Admiral was now a man named Charles Howard of Effingham, and he was in command of the Queen's navy. His plan was to have Lords Winter and Hawkins await the Armada in the middle of the Channel, while the Lord Admiral Howard himself and Sir Francis Drake would wait at and near Plymouth. They would be in a fleet of sleek, fast, and heavily armed smaller vessels that would be able to chase and harry the Spanish. They were going to follow behind the Armada after it sailed into the Channel. The plan was to allow the Spanish Armada to sail until it nearly encountered the fleet of larger English galleons, and then the Lord Admiral and Drake would come up behind them, bite their heels, and then catch the Armada in the crossfire and demolish her. Now, the plans of both sides were interrupted by some inclement weather. Some of those famous Channel storms blew in, and the fleets of both the Spanish and the English, well, their timetables and their charts were thrown off course, so they had to regroup and make some new plans as quickly as possible. However, the basic plan for Drake to follow behind still stood because Drake and his fleet were still at harbor. Legend has it that when Drake received word of the Spanish Armada entering the Channel, he said, "Time enough to finish the game," and beat the Spanish after. Now, this sounds like some of Drake's famous propaganda, but this might actually be something that he said. See, the tide was high in Plymouth Harbor at the time. It was too high for the fleet to leave, and he knew they would have to wait until sundown. However, once sundown came, the fleet did set sail, and they rushed after the Spanish Armada. When the Duke of Medina Sidonia awoke the next morning, it must have been something of a shock to him. He found the English fleet not before him as he had thought, but waiting behind. Their entire formation was planned to meet the English fleet waiting before them. However, that formation and the Armada itself must have been something of a fright as well. It was at least 2 miles in width. It was a virtual forest of mast and sail, punctuated by these massive Spanish aft castles who towered over the smaller English vessels. Lord Admiral Howard said, quote, "All the world never saw such a great force as there was." End quote. All the same, Lord Howard ordered a single pinnace called Defiance forward to fire a single shot at the Spanish flagship. This was a gesture of formal challenge. Think of a knight pulling off his glove and slapping another man in challenge for a duel. This was that sort of move. The Spanish, they had their ships arrayed in 4 columns. Their heaviest ships were in the center, with their faster and smaller galleys along the sides. They made a tight crescent formation, all meant to face forward so they could surround the English fleet whenever they encountered it. However, somehow, these massive vessels had to turn around and change their entire formation because they were now facing a force that was coming from the opposite direction. Really, their formation was perfect. The Spanish were spectacular sailors. If the English had been waiting in front, they would have destroyed them immediately. However, they didn't account for what the English actually had planned. I'm going to quote historian Arthur Herman in his book To Rule the Waves, How the British Navy Shaped the Modern World, which is really a pretty excellent read, especially for any nautical or military historians out there. It goes all the way from the very earliest days of the British Navy to all the way up until World War II. He writes about this battle, quote, "The English rushed forward with gun ports open and as many guns wheeled and lashed pointing forward as possible. This was no classic battle of broadsides. Each gun was aimed on its own while the master gunner himself gave orders to the helm. Bow chasers fired first, then the guns on the leeward side, and, as the ship turned, then the guns in the stern as the boatswain shouted to his men aloft to lull sails and brought the ship to a halt. Then, as the ship turned back, the guns on the other broadside opened up as the ship completed its stately pirouette past its target. Wreathed in smoke, the Revenge, or Bear, or Vanguard, then tacked back windward to reload. In this way, the English guns got off an average of a shot an hour, whereas the Spanish, keeping to their tight box formation, were sometimes lucky if their guns could fire back 1 shot a day." End quote. It was really, at the end of the day, an ineffectual battle on both sides. While the English had proved that they could fire many more shots, their tactics weren't doing a whole lot of damage to the Spanish fleet. They took out a few of the smaller vessels, but from the distances they were firing, they were unable to take out any of the massive Spanish warships. As night fell, though, Drake was given the order to light the lantern on his stern that would guide the way for the rest of the fleets. On the Spanish side, they faced disaster. While their ships were still nearly all floating, the Nuestra Señora de Rosario was rammed by another Spanish vessel in the night. The Rosario lost her bowsprit, her mizzenmast, and her mainyard. Then, in a separate event, another ship in the Armada carrying somewhere near 383 men and almost all of the gold meant to pay the soldiers suddenly exploded. It's unclear exactly what happened, but apparently something lit their entire powder magazine alight. In the chaos after this explosion, Francis Drake seized on an opportunity. He broke formation from the fleet, endangering all of those relying on his lantern, and he took the Rosario, along with the reported 55,000 golden ducats aboard, and he ordered the ship to be sailed home. Despite Francis Drake's knighthood, all of his titles and his lands, he still couldn't fight what he was at heart, a loathsome, no-good, West Country pirate. The next morning, when Lord Admiral Howard came on deck, he discovered that he had not in fact been following Sir Francis Drake's lantern, but one for the Armada. A fierce morning firefight ensued, the exact kind of thing that a good English navyman needed to get the blood pumping, but he managed to remove himself from the Spanish Armada. Francis Drake returned to the fleet and was called on board of the Lord Admiral's ship. There's no record of exactly what the Lord Admiral said to Francis Drake, but man, I wish there was, because I imagine that even the Spanish in the Armada, a mile or more away, could hear the curses of this old sea captain to Francis Drake. The Admiral went on to confiscate the 55,000 ducats and send it to London. The Admiral ordered that the English would continue dogging the Spanish fleet, and the fight on water continued the same way for the next day. On land, Elizabeth stood before her rallied troops, who were preparing to defend the city of London and the land of England against any invasion. She gave them this speech, quote, "My loving people, who have been persuaded by some that are careful for our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes, for fear of treachery, but I assure you, I do not desire to live in distrust, my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and good will of my subjects, and therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live or die amongst you all, and to lay down for my God, and for my kingdom, and for my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, in the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid you." End quote. Imagine her surprise, as well as the surprise of Admiral Medina Sidonia, when none of those troop ships arrived. Perhaps Elizabeth wasn't so surprised after all. The troops had never even left port. The sea beggars had sailed south, swooped in, and halted any thought of Parma's of setting sail. It was here that the Spanish Armada knew they were lost. On the third day, short on food, shot, powder, and soldiers, the English finally closed ranks and opened fire. Finally, the English had found their mark at 300 yards, which would become the naval policy for firefights for centuries. They sank dozens of Spanish vessels, but still the Armada stood in tight formation. The English captains, they began to worry. Despite their superior battle skills, how could they defeat that armada? So, after nightfall, 8 smaller English vessels sailed silently forward toward the armada. Their guns were charged fully to the muzzles. Their decks and their holds were filled with pitch, tar, and hemp, anything that would burn. The Spanish saw these ships primed to explode and burn any vessel nearby, and they all managed to escape unharmed. But in this attempt to set the Spanish Armada alight, it broke their formation, and finally, the English were able to attack. The English closed in. This was the beginning of the first great naval engagement in modern history. A total of 200 ships fired bravely, even recklessly, in a fight for their lives, for their homes, and for their countries. The Spanish never backed down. Each of the ships fired until they were out of powder and shot, and then they would sail towards the English vessels, grapple that ship, and do hand-to-hand combat with the men on board, either dying or taking the ship. But still, the Spanish were outmatched. The English ships were too well armed and too fast. The air in the English Channel was filled with smoke, the deafening sound of cannon, and in the interim between shots, the screams of the dying. Any vessel worth her salt was coated in splinter and tattered sail, amidst the gore of men without arms and legs and heads. The seas were covered in a sheen of dead bodies, broken ships, and blood. A storm arose, bringing in clouds and fog to mingle with the smoke from the battle, and in that moment, the Spanish Armada set sail and fled. Perhaps Philip was right, in part. He said that God would send them fair weather, and when the Spanish Armada was nearly lost and completely destroyed, a storm came in and saved them. Their odyssey was not over, and the trip back to Spain was going to be extremely difficult for these men, but many still made it home, more than would have had that storm not blown in. The English didn't believe that this was the end of the invasion. However, it was. The Spanish had fled. There were no troops coming from the Netherlands. The English had won the day. Now, this undeclared war between Spain and England, though, it would continue. The 80 Years' War, the conflict for Dutch independence, that would continue too. And the hatred between Catholics and Protestants in Europe would continue for centuries. Queen Elizabeth, King Philip, and Francis Drake would continue their dance. But this is a suitable place to stop. The Armada's defeat marked a turning point in the world. It showed the world that Spain was not all-powerful, and it opened up the ambitions of all of the colonial powers in Europe. It was by no means the end of the Spanish Empire, but it marked the beginning of their decline, and it marked the dawn of the British Empire and the colossal power struggles that would continue for centuries, and really, we're still fighting to this modern day. This Spanish Armada's defeat showed the world that the future would not be won by soldiers on land or on horseback. It would be won by sailors on the back of ships. Elizabeth would continue her rule for years and rule over some of the most prosperous times in English history. Elizabethan England would bring us an English Renaissance. It would bring us Shakespeare and the birth of the modern English language. It would see a shift in English culture towards a more free, open, and democratic society. Sir Francis Drake was far from done. He continued to sail, and his legend continued to grow. He sailed again and again, back to Spain, into the Caribbean, never ending Drake's War, his personal conflict with the Spanish. But he passed away at Portobello at the end of a difficult voyage of raiding and piracy at 4 a.m., January 28th, 1596. And with him, we're going to leave the Elizabethan age behind. The reason we've spent so much time on this era, the Elizabethan period, and Francis Drake in particular, is because these conflicts are really what set the stage for the colonial conflicts in the Caribbean. And Francis Drake, more than anyone else, showed the world that a single man with a sleek, small, fast ship filled with guns and manned by a loyal crew of people with insufficient morals would be able to challenge the empires of the old world and make themselves rich and powerful men. His was really the story that all pirates in the years to come would see and believe that they could make a reality. He was the goal that men such as Henry Avery and Edward Teach were. Well, that's what they wanted to be. They wanted to be Francis Drake, a man who was a patriot fighting for his country and using less than scrupulous means to achieve it. They also wanted to fill their pockets, which was something that Francis Drake did extremely well. In the end, Francis Drake stole, in modern dollars, $115 million worth of Spanish loot. This makes him, according to Forbes magazine, the second most successful pirate in history. Next time, we're going to take a jump forward. The politics of Europe are going to go through a lot of upheavals, but most of that is relatively unimportant. We'll talk about the big stuff, but we're going to start focusing on another of the most successful pirates in history. A man who graces the front of many bottles of cheap rum, Captain Henry Morgan. If you're enjoying the show, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. Over there, you can find some supplemental information, such as maps and works of art relating to our topics. We also have, on every episode, a list of the sources used. If you're interested in learning more about any of the topics that we cover, those source lists also have links that go to the abebooks.com page for that book, where you can pick up a copy of anything you'd like to read more about. If you do use that service, Abe Books is kind enough to throw me a couple of bucks. We also have an Abe Books search bar at the website. If you'd like to support the show, there are several ways you can do so at the website. There's a PayPal donate button, as well as a link to our Patreon page. That's going to patreon.com/piratehistorypodcast. There's also an Abe Books and Amazon search bar, so if you need to search for anything on either Abe Books or Amazon.com, if you do so through the website, they're kind enough to throw me a couple of bucks. In addition to any of that, you can also leave a review on either iTunes, Stitcher, or Podbean, all of which we have links for at the website. Doing this really helps get the podcast noticed, and we really appreciate it. Once again, and most importantly, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening.